Hi, today I wanted to talk about Martin Hengel, this book, Property and Riches in the Early Church. Martin Hengel, who lived from 1926 to 2009, was a German historian of religion as well as something of a New Testament scholar. And he's had immense influence upon the way that many Christians in the Western world look upon the subject of the Bible's attitude towards riches and towards poverty. Now, Hengel starts off this book with an analysis of the prophets of the Old Testament, because after all, they set the stage for any analysis of what the New Testament says about wealth and what it says about poverty. In the book, he starts off by referring to, well, I'll use his own words. The right to property was in principle subordinated to the obligation to care for the weaker members of society. He says that's the starting principle. Let me read that again. The right to property was in principle subordinated to the obligation to care for the weaker members of society. And he goes from there to talk about how this momentum began in Judaism with the prophets of the 8th century BC, starting with Amos. Amos said, for instance, therefore, to the rich people of the northern kingdom of Israel, he said, therefore, because you trample the poor and take from him exactions of wheat, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not dwell in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions, how great are your sins. You who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe and turn aside the needy at the gate. That's from Amos chapter 5. He continues, hear this, you who trample upon the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we may offer wheat for sale? This is the prophecy of Amos. Hengel then takes us to Isaiah, maybe a passage that's even more famous than Amos's. This is from Isaiah chapter 5. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there's no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil, that they may make the fatherless their prey. What will you do in the day of punishment, in the storm which will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help? Where will you leave your wealth? That's Isaiah chapter 5 and chapter 10. He goes on to make the comparison with what was going on in Athens, in Greece. Not too many generations after that, when Solon, the great lawgiver and social reformer, had risen to prominence. Solon wrote this about Athens at that time, around 600 BC. But the citizens themselves, driven by the desire for money, are blinded and seek the fall of our mighty city. For the leaders of the people are wicked, evil-minded, and thereby only bring painful suffering upon themselves. Their greed is insatiable. They do not know how to enjoy with order and sobriety the pleasures of the feast. The riches they heap up come from violence and wrong. Neither what the gods possess nor what belongs to man is spared by their appetite. They're not ashamed of open robbery. They have no regard for Dike, that's the goddess of righteousness, and her sacred commandment. So what Isaiah and Amos saw in the 8th century and the 9th century BC, in Jerusalem and Israel, Solon saw in Athens, in Greece. Hengel goes on to talk about the significance of the Jubilee and the year of release. Deuteronomy chapter 15 talks about a year of release of debt every 7 years. This was mandatory upon Israel. And then Leviticus 25 talks about the Jubilee Year. And this is what Hengel says about the Jubilee. The reason given for this redistribution of the land was that Yahweh was the real owner of the Holy Land. Let me read that again. The reason given for this redistribution of land was that Yahweh was the real owner of the land. Although in the same chapter, chapter 25 of Leviticus, it says that each of you shall return to his own property. That's also in the same chapter, 25. God himself is called the owner of the land. So in early Christianity, this was the backdrop. God himself was regarded as the owner of Israel, and therefore the promised land, what we would call the Holy Land, was his. But he had given it to his own people under the law of Genesis, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. And when Jesus and the apostles were upon the earth, we might see even from the Gospels and from the book of James in particular, this struggle in the Jewish milieu of the time was over who really owned the land at this point, because after all, the Romans occupied it. The Romans were the ones who technically were distributing the land. The Sadducees, that is the priestly class, had most of the property by this time. Hengel says this: the Romans and the rulers appointed by them, like Herod and his successors, continued this form of extreme exploitation of the land. Great estates forced back the free peasant farmers, and the number of landless tenants increased, particularly after the time of Herod. So this is the social scene when Jesus and the apostles first arrive. Hengel goes on to say, we can understand why the Jewish struggles for freedom, first of all that of the Maccabees against the Macedonian Seleucids, and then later that of the Zealots against the Romans. They were always also social struggles. When the Jewish rebels plundered Jerusalem in AD 66 from their base in the temple, the first thing that they burnt was the city archive with the land registers and the accounts of debts. That's based upon the account of Flavius Josephus in his book, The Jewish War. So the first thing that the Zealots wanted to accomplish was the redistribution of the land. And of course, they were going to do it forcibly. But what they wanted to do forcibly, to take away the land that was now being almost exclusively the property of the priestly class under the authority of Rome, what they wanted to do forcibly was what the law had mandated all along, which Israel had failed to apply both before the exile and after. So Hengel wants this to be our consideration as we discuss property and riches in the early church. So we have to start with the Jewish background and understand just how deeply rooted in the biblical picture is this idea of social equality. Not, interestingly, property free, i.e., this is not communism we're talking about. Property was still private, but there was a general equality mandated by the law in the distribution of the land originally under Joshua. This was the principle, that men should have the amount of land they needed to live under God. So that's Martin Hengel. See you next time.
Bye.